Daniel Carter sat in his sleek glass-walled office, staring at the reports scattered across his mahogany desk. Numbers, trends, and polished corporate jargon blurred together, but one recurring issue stood out: employee dissatisfaction. His franchise empire, built from the ground up, was supposed to be a beacon of opportunity, yet whispers of mistreatment and plummeting morale reached him with increasing frequency. His executives assured him it was nothing. They fed him rehearsed lines about expected turnover rates and industry standards, but Daniel hadn't built his company by ignoring his instincts. Something wasn't right. He needed to see the truth for himself, unfiltered and raw. 2 days later, Daniel stood in front of one of his highest-earning franchises, dressed in a plain blue uniform, steel-toed boots, and a name tag that read Mike Reynolds. His signature tailored suits had been replaced with second-hand jeans. His neatly styled hair now flattened under a baseball cap. The store loomed before him, its bright signage a stark contrast to the sinking feeling in his gut. The first step inside was jarring. He expected efficiency, order, at the very least, professionalism. Instead, chaos ruled. Understaffed and overwhelmed, employees moved at a frantic pace, dodging customers while scrambling to restock shelves and manage long checkout lines. The air was thick with tension, a quiet desperation clinging to every interaction. No one acknowledged him. No greeting, no introduction. The store manager, a burly man in his early 40s with a permanent scowl, barely glanced up from his clipboard. Daniel recognized him from internal reports. Brad Coleman, a supposed model manager, praised for keeping labor costs down and revenue high. "You're the new guy?" Brad grunted, tapping his pen against the clipboard. "Mike, right?" Daniel nodded. Brad didn't bother with pleasantries. "Good. No slacking. No questions. Do what you're told." He motioned toward the stockroom with a jerk of his chin. "Unload the shipment. Fast." The stockroom was sweltering, boxes stacked haphazardly, some ripped open from careless handling. Daniel rolled up his sleeves and got to work, feeling every bit of his 45 years in the strain of heavy lifting. He wasn't above hard labor. He had started with nothing, once worked shifts just like these. But that was decades ago. He had forgotten what it felt like. A sharp voice snapped him from his thoughts. "You're doing it wrong." Daniel turned to see a woman in her 50s, her uniform faded, her posture rigid with experience. Linda, her name tag read. She crossed her arms, scrutinizing his handling of the boxes. "Brad'll have your head if you don't pick up the pace," she warned, though there was no cruelty in her tone, only exhaustion. "I'll manage," Daniel said, adjusting his grip. She eyed him for a moment before sighing. "Suit yourself." Hours bled together. Customers grew impatient at the understaffed registers. Employees darted between tasks with no reprieve. Conversations were clipped, movements mechanical. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a pattern. Then he heard it. A choke sob muffled behind a stack of boxes near the back of the stockroom. Daniel rounded the corner and saw her, Sophie. Young, barely out of her teens, curled in on herself, hands clutching at her sleeves as silent tears slipped down her face. He froze. Every instinct screamed at him to intervene, but he hesitated. He was supposed to be just another worker, not a CEO with the power to fix this with a single phone call. Still, he couldn't walk away. "Sophie." He kept his voice low, careful. She startled, hastily wiping at her eyes. I'm fine. Sorry. It was a lie. A rehearsed one." "Did something happen?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, too quickly. "It's just work. Just a bad day." A door slammed somewhere in the store, and she flinched. Daniel followed her gaze. Through the small stockroom window, Brad stalked across the store floor, his expression thunderous as he barked orders. Daniel's stomach turned to lead. Sophie hurried to her feet, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to go." She brushed past him before he could say another word. Moments later, she was gone, disappearing into the frantic rhythm of the store. Daniel stood there, fists clenched, pulse hammering. He had come here expecting inefficiency, maybe some bad management. He hadn't expected this. This was something worse. Daniel quickly learned that the store operated on unspoken rules. ones that had nothing to do with company policy. The official employee handbook meant nothing here. Instead, survival depended on obedience, silence, and an ability to endure. Each shift felt like stepping onto a battlefield. The employees worked themselves to the bone, moving at an unsustainable pace under Brad's watchful eye. No one dared to speak out, not even when break times were quietly slashed or when schedules were changed at the last minute, forcing them to cancel personal plans. Complaints were met with thinly veiled threats, and those who protested too much simply stopped showing up. Daniel had been in leadership long enough to recognize fear when he saw it. Linda, the veteran employee, had perfected the art of blending in. She moved efficiently, avoided eye contact, and never gave Brad a reason to single her out. Yet, even she flinched whenever he raised his voice. Carlos, a younger worker who handled deliveries, seemed perpetually on edge. He worked harder than most, always the first to clock in and the last to leave. One evening, Daniel found him counting crumpled bills from his pocket, his lips pressed into a tight line. "You okay?" Daniel asked. Carlos hesitated before shoving the money back into his pocket. "Yeah, just rent's due." There was more to it, but Daniel knew better than to push too soon. Then there was Sophie. She had returned to work, but something in her had changed. She kept her head down, her eyes hollow. She spoke only when necessary, and even then, her words were clipped mechanical. Daniel caught Brad watching her more than once, an amused smirk playing at his lips whenever she hurried past him. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they painted made Daniel's stomach churn. One evening, after the store had closed, Daniel lingered near the stockroom, pretending to reorganize a shelf. Brad was on the phone in his office, his voice low but sharp. "I don't care what she said. She's done here." A pause. "Yeah, I made sure of it. She won't talk." Daniel's grip tightened around the box in his hands. There was no doubt now. Sophie had been forced out. But why? He needed to find her. The next morning, Daniel clocked out early and tracked down her address from the outdated employee contact sheet in the break room. It wasn't difficult. She lived in a small apartment complex a few blocks from the store. When he knocked, the door opened just a crack, a chain still fastened. Sophie's tired eyes widened when she saw him. "Mike," he hesitated before nodding. "I just wanted to check on you." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, with a sigh, she unlatched the door and stepped aside. The apartment was sparse, bare walls, second-hand furniture, a pile of unpaid bills on the kitchen table. A faint hum of a medical machine came from another room. "My mom's sleeping," she murmured, noticing his glance. "She's sick." Daniel felt a pang of guilt. His company had boasted about creating jobs, yet here was one of his employees struggling to survive. Sophie sat on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. "You shouldn't be here. Brad forced you out, didn't he?" Daniel asked. A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Forced? No. He just made it impossible to stay." She took a shaky breath, eyes fixed on the floor. "It started with small things. Cutting my hours, messing with my schedule so I couldn't plan my mom's doctor visits. Then he started finding reasons to write me up, things I didn't even do." Daniel stayed silent, letting her continue. "He cornered me in the break room one night," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Said he could make things easier for me, if I just played along." Her fingers clenched around the fabric of her sleeves. "When I said no, everything got worse." Daniel felt a slow, burning rage coil in his chest. "He knew I needed the job," she continued. "And when I started pushing back, he made sure I didn't have one anymore." Silence settled between them. "I thought about reporting it," she admitted, her voice hollow. "But Brad's been there for years. Who would believe me? Who would care?" Daniel did. He rose to his feet, his decision made. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "I promise you this isn't over." Sophie gave him a tired smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. Good luck. As Daniel stepped outside, the cool air did nothing to temper the fire inside him. He had come here looking for answers. Now he had them. And Brad had no idea what was coming. Daniel returned to the store with a quiet fury simmering beneath his carefully maintained disguise. Every interaction, every forced smile, every barked order from Brad was another crack in his restraint. But he couldn't afford to explode, not yet. He spent the next few days watching, listening, gathering everything he needed. Employees were terrified to speak, but their exhaustion spoke for them. He watched Carlos struggle to make ends meet, saw Linda endure the weight of years spent under Brad's rule, and felt the crushing atmosphere of a workplace running on fear. Brad operated like a king ruling over his kingdom with unchecked power. He kept the staff in a perpetual state of unease, pitting employees against each other, dangling extra shifts like rewards, and punishing those who fell out of line. Daniel let himself become a thorn in Brad's side. It started small, subtle defiance. He took his breaks despite Brad's obvious disapproval. He helped coworkers with tasks Brad wanted them to struggle through alone. He asked questions, small ones at first, nudging at the edges of the toxic culture. Brad noticed. One evening, after the rush had died down and most of the staff had filtered out, Brad leaned against the office doorway, watching as Daniel restocked a shelf. "You're not as dumb as you look, Mike," he said, voice thick with amusement. Daniel didn't turn around. "Thanks, I guess." Brad chuckled. "You don't ask for extra shifts. You don't grovel. And you sure as hell don't act like someone who needs this job." Daniel set down the box he was holding and met Brad's gaze. "Maybe I just don't like being treated like dirt." The smirk on Brad's face faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "You're funny," he said, pushing off the doorframe. "But let me give you some advice. Keep your head down. People who don't tend to have accidents." Daniel held his ground. "Like Sophie." Brad's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Daniel folded his arms, his voice dangerously even. "I think I do." Brad stepped closer, the easy arrogance in his demeanor replaced by something colder. "She was a problem," he said, "and problems get taken care of." The confession hung between them like a loaded gun. Daniel had heard enough. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, tilting the screen toward Brad. The recording app was still running. Brad's face drained of color. "You." Daniel cut him off, slipping the phone back into his pocket. "I have everything I need," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "The threats, the mistreatment, the way you've been running this place like your own personal empire." Brad's jaw clenched. "You think some recording is enough to take me down?" He scoffed. "I've been here for years. People like you come and go. No one's going to believe some low-level employee over me." Daniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the thing, Brad," he said, stepping forward. "I'm not a low-level employee." And then, in a single deliberate motion, he removed his cap, raking a hand through his hair, standing taller, shedding the persona he had carefully constructed. Recognition dawned in Brad's eyes, followed by pure, unfiltered panic. Daniel let the silence stretch between them, savoring the moment. "I own this company," he said, "and you're done." Brad stumbled back, his bluster crumbling. This is a setup." Daniel tilted his head. "No, Brad. This is justice." Before Brad could react, the doors opened, and two corporate executives stepped inside, flanked by security personnel. Brad spun around, wild-eyed. "Wait." Linda, Carlos, and the remaining employees watched from a floor as security escorted Brad out. A stunned silence followed, the weight of what had just happened settling over them. Daniel turned to his employees, and finally, spoke the words they had long needed to hear. This ends today. The store was silent long after Brad was escorted out. Employees stood frozen in place, as if waiting for the moment to be undone, for the nightmare to continue. But Brad wasn't coming back. Daniel exhaled slowly, letting the weight of his true identity settle over the room. Linda was the first to speak. "You're really him, aren't you?" Her voice was quiet, uncertain. Daniel nodded. "Yes." Murmurs rippled through the remaining employees. Carlos took a step forward, disbelief etched across his face. "So all this time you've been watching us?" Daniel met his gaze. "I needed to see the truth. And now that I have, things are going to change." Skepticism lingered in their eyes. They had spent too long under a system that didn't listen, under leadership that only saw them as numbers on a spreadsheet. Promises meant nothing to them. Only action would. Daniel knew that. The next morning, he called a company-wide meeting. Executives flew in, HR representatives took notes, and corporate policies that had once been enforced in theory but ignored in practice were now at the forefront of discussion. Brad's offenses were not isolated. Reports flooded in from other locations. Stories of intimidation, unfair terminations, wage theft. What had started as one man's abuse of power was revealed to be part of a larger, more insidious issue. Daniel stood before his employees, addressing them not as a CEO perched atop an ivory tower, but as a leader who had failed them and was ready to do better. "Sophie should never have been forced out," he said, his voice steady but filled with regret. "No one should have to choose between their dignity and their paycheck. That ends now." One by one, policies changed. Anonymous reporting systems were implemented. Third-party oversight was introduced. Pay structures were reassessed. The entire corporate culture shifted, no longer focused on cutting costs at the expense of those who kept the company running. But change wasn't just about systems. It was about people. Daniel personally reached out to Sophie. When she opened the door, surprise flickered across her face, but it was guarded. She had learned not to trust promises. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Daniel said, "but I want to make things right." Sophie listened as he offered her job back, under different management, with better pay, with the respect she had always deserved. But it wasn't just about a job. He also handed her an envelope. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a check, not just to cover the wages she had lost, but enough to help with her mother's medical expenses. Her eyes welled with tears. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Daniel replied. "Just know that I see you. And I'm sorry." For the first time since he had met her, Sophie smiled. A real, genuine smile. As he walked away, Daniel felt something shift within him. He had built an empire. But now, for the first time, he was building something that truly mattered. This wasn't just justice. This was redemption.